This week on Inside Scoop, is peace even possible in Ukraine? Examining the American right after Bill Buckley. And New York braces for a very different kind of red wave. Welcome to Inside Scoop, where we talk about all the news that's fit to print in the Washington Examiner magazine. I'm Jim Antle, your host. And this week, our Tevi Troy wrote about William F. Buckley Jr., who late last month would have turned 100 years old, and Buckley's pivotal role as a gatekeeper and sort of the policeman of the ranks of the modern American right. Buckley was an important conservative movement figure. He edited an important magazine in National Review. He hosted a television show on PBS, of all places, called Firing Line. He wrote a widely syndicated national column that appeared in many newspapers. And he also was involved in numerous conservative political organizations, including the Conservative Party of New York State, which helped elect his brother to the U.S. Senate for a single term without the support of either the Republican or Democratic Party. But conservatism during the New Deal and after World War II was spent as a political force, and it needed new people and new voices to bring it back to the political forefront. And one of the things that Buckley did as a young man, in addition to writing his first books like God and Man at Yale and founding some of the organizations and publications that he was involved in, was that Buckley was trying to form a political movement that could compete with modern American liberalism, which was then dominant, which does not sound like it would be something difficult to do in today's world, but at the time in the 1950s, conservatism really wasn't even the dominant strain of the Republican Party. There was a very strong liberal Rockefeller wing of that party, and so Buckley really needed to find new conservative talent, promote that talent, and sometimes he had to expel people who were a little bit eccentric, perhaps fully crazy, and in many cases, even a bit bigoted. Perhaps they were racist, perhaps they were anti-Semitic. Buckley tried to keep these people out of his organizations and out of the pages of his publications. And as Tevi writes in his piece for the Washington Examiner magazine this week, he really functioned as a bit of a gatekeeper. And this really ranged all the time from the 1960s, when the John Birch Society was a very large conservative organization at the grassroots, but perhaps something that was never really going to be accepted by the mainstream, all the way through to after the Cold War was over and there were all of these new debates bursting out on the right, and Buckley ended up having some debates with figures like Pat Buchanan, who wanted to change some aspects of conservatism and particularly conservative foreign policy after the Soviet Union collapsed and the West won the Cold War. Buckley himself went from being an America firster before the beginning of World War II to a preeminent Cold War hawk throughout our conflict with Soviet communism, to somebody who was skeptical of American foreign policy adventures after 9/11 in places like Iraq. The conservative media environment is very different today, however, than it was in the days of William F. Buckley Jr., making it very difficult for someone like Buckley, who died in 2008, to have the same kind of influence over what people say and do as was perhaps possible in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. So we have the internet, quite obviously, which is how you're watching us today, and many media personalities, conservative social media influencers, have become very influential, and they don't come through any of these traditional organizational processes or editorial processes necessarily, and there really isn't any gatekeeper for them. In a way, it's very similar to the larger media environment that Buckley himself was trying to compete against when he started out. Nobody really relies on a Walter Cronkite type figure anymore to gain all of their information or trusts as deeply in somebody like a Walter Cronkite or anything in the so-called mainstream legacy media the way that they once did. And that helped fuel the rise of conservative media and the conservative movement. But now the conservative movement is contending with some of those problems within its own media landscape, in that there are no gatekeepers for us anymore, and we can really find our audiences online, and there's really no limiting principle to who might become popular and whose arguments might win the day. Is this truly a free market in ideas that maybe conservatives should celebrate? Or do we run the risk of radicalization and problems and division and some of the things that could have marginalized the conservative movement all those many decades ago, before we went from the transition from Barry Goldwater to Ronald Reagan to Donald Trump today? Do we need our own William F. Buckley Jr. in 2025 and 2026? Is that even possible? Write a comment down below. Tell us what you think. This week I'm joined by Editor-in-Chief Hugo Gurdon to discuss our coverage of the Russia-Ukraine diplomacy. Welcome, Hugo.
Thanks for having me.
So Hugo, you wrote in your letter from the editor this week about how difficult this Russia-Ukraine peace process is and how, in fact, elusive peace may actually be.
Yes, it seems to me that although there seems to be at least expressions of optimism from the Trump administration and from the negotiators, that one would bet, if one were betting one's last dollar, that this isn't going to work out, because it still seems to me that the maximum that Ukraine can plausibly be expected to offer is less than the minimum that Vladimir Putin is demanding. Mm-hmm. And the truth is that Putin has not had sufficient pressure put on him to lessen his demands. He's not paying the price, except in the cost of death of a lot of Russian soldiers. But as I wrote in the piece, historically Russia has been willing to have its own people killed in high numbers in war, right, because they just see that as a cost of doing business.
Mm-hmm. So in addition to your letter, the cover story in this week's issue of the magazine is by Tim Carney. Tim was over in Ukraine, and one of the points he makes in his on-the-ground reporting over there is that Ukraine is sort of in the unenviable position of being a buffer between Russia and the West, which maybe it doesn't really want to be, but geographically that's just the reality.
Yeah, exactly. He makes the good point, and it may seem obvious, but it's worth restating. The one thing that Ukraine cannot do is move. It's going to be next to Russia, between Russia and the rest of Western Europe, no matter what the deal is. And the point that Tim makes, or one of the points he makes, I think very well, is that Ukraine, recognizing this and recognizing the advantage to the West in having a buffer state between itself and Russia, is something that should actuate the thinking of the West. It's not a war that is simply about helping Ukraine, helping this liberal democracy, if one would like to think of Ukraine as being that. Mm-hmm. It's about strengthening the West's resistance to Russian aggression. Russia, no matter what the terms of any peace deal come to, Russia continues to have, and will, I think, for the foreseeable future, continue to have dreams of a sort of the re-establishment of the Russian Empire. At the moment, that's very much what Putin wants. Mm-hmm. But there's no reason to suppose that in the post-Putin era, that the next person who comes along will suddenly abandon all that and say, it'll be a peace in our time. It's much more likely that the dreams of the re-establishment of the Russian Empire, which preceded Putin, preceded the Soviet Union, and goes all the way back into Imperial Russian days, it'll crumble at some point. But until that point, it's going to have designs on Ukraine. And if the point that we make in the magazine is that it's in American and Western interests to strengthen Ukraine, to provide it with the aid that will allow it to resist Russian expansion. And of course, we can learn a lot from Ukraine as well, because they have become preeminent in the fighting of modern land war. They've developed drone technology and drone fighting strategies and techniques from which we could very much learn.
So President Trump obviously comes from a real estate background, and Steve Witkoff, who's one of his main negotiators, comes from a similar background. Right. But when President Trump has been successful diplomatically, it's usually been because he's had some kind of leverage over the parties involved. And the Gaza peace agreement, however temporary that may or may not prove to be, he had a certain amount of leverage over both parties involved, and arguably all parties involved. In this fight, he really hasn't seemed to have found an effective leverage point against Russia yet, or been willing to at least.
No. Well, that's the thing. He hasn't had leverage because he's chosen, for whatever reasons, not to exercise the leverage that he could apply. He keeps talking, or up until these new peace talks and the 28-point proposal, which has become a 19-point proposal. Up until that point, for several months, he was talking about slapping heavy sanctions on Russia, undermining its oil industry by sanctioning nations like India, China, and others that bought Russian oil. He could also cut Russia out from the sort of international financing system. Although he has kept on talking about those things, he's never actually done it. So he's not applied any leverage, not secured for himself any leverage. And it seems to me that the only way that there will be peace, I'm afraid not very hopeful about the current negotiations, is once the price of continuing the war rises for Putin. And one of the problems of the new peace proposals and the negotiations is that once again it has released Russia from pressure, reduced the pressure on Russia. All the talk that was of sanctions that were being expressed beforehand, being expressed by the president and others, has now dissipated, because what they're now focused on doing is trying to secure some sort of peace deal. And most of the pressure seems to be on Ukraine rather than on Russia. The negotiations are now moving to Moscow. We've had a couple of rounds perhaps it is, in Geneva. There were further talks this last weekend in Miami. At these, there's a new Ukrainian negotiating team. It looks like it's more willing than the previous one to enter compromises. But there's nothing to suggest yet that Moscow, that Putin is willing to reduce its demands. It still wants to take more Ukrainian territory than it has managed to conquer with its armed forces. It still wants the Ukrainian armed forces to be cut very substantially. These are things which seem to me, and seem to a lot of Ukrainians and a lot of analysts, to suggest that what Russia is doing is using these peace proposals simply to weaken Ukraine and make it more vulnerable to further attack, when, as seems likely, the tyrant in the Kremlin decides it's time to break his word again.
So there does seem to be an element of this where America's posture seems to be to a certain degree dictated by whether in a given moment President Trump is more irritated with Zelensky or Putin, and that has varied over time.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, and I think that actually also helps our understanding of why these peace negotiations are, I think, less likely to succeed than to fail. I think that Zelensky's posture in these talks is just to stay on the right side of Trump. I think both sides probably think these talks are not going to work, but neither one wants to get the blame. Zelensky, as everybody will remember, had a dreadful encounter with President Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance in the Oval Office earlier this year, where it was just an absolute ruction and a breakdown. Yes. And it was very quickly thereafter that Zelensky realized that he had to come back, cap in hand, and praising the United States. There's one thing that this president really will not abide, and that is to be treated with disrespect or sort of aggressive pushback. I think that what Zelensky is doing now is looking as though he's absolutely on board, trying to be the reasonable person, hoping that the deal can be massaged in his direction and Ukraine's direction, sufficient that it is Putin who walks away from the deal and says, this is absolutely unacceptable. He gets the blame. What Putin wants is, he doesn't want Trump's wrath, and he doesn't want Putin to run the table. So if you massage the deal and the proposals in Ukraine's favor or towards Ukraine, Putin doesn't get to run the table, doesn't get everything he wants, and you avoid Trump being furious with you.
Thank you, Hugo.
Thank you.
You can read Hugo's full letter and Tim Carney's cover story by clicking here in our digital magazine. Is Zohran Mamdani-style socialism coming to a city near you? His popularity with the Democratic Socialist Squad could mean he'll have a lot of imitators in the Democratic Party, and that the next red wave could look very different with Marxist control of Congress after the 2026 midterm elections. Our Amy DeLaura explains why New York City is bracing for Mamdani.
We will prove that there is no problem too large for government to solve and no concern too small for it to care about.
Zohran Mamdani, a card-carrying member of the Democratic Socialists of America, beat former Governor Andrew Cuomo in a general election with turnout rivaling a presidential year.
If anyone can show a nation betrayed by Donald Trump how to defeat him, it is the city that gave rise to him.
Meanwhile, President Donald Trump, watching from the White House, fired off a Truth Social taunt during the speech. The numbers behind the impending federal versus city government fight are terrifying. New York receives roughly $10 billion in federal aid every year, including grants and reimbursements. Mamdani's first-term agenda: fare-free buses, approximately $650 million annually. City-owned grocery stores, that's $180 million yearly, plus a startup cost of $300 million. Universal public childcare, $5 billion a year, that's half the budget, and a fast track to the $30 minimum wage. Either it requires that federal money to stay intact or the full $10 billion in new corporate and millionaire taxes he has promised. Legal war rooms are already humming. Mamdani's transition team has quietly retained the ACLU's state power litigation team. On the other side, Trump's attorney general will have a menu of pressure points. The first federal complaint could land before the new mayor finishes his inaugural address on January 1st. When Trump and Mamdani met at the White House in November, it was cordial. Trump expressed high hopes for Mamdani's mayorship and even appeared to forgive the Democrat for calling him a fascist.
Are you affirming that you think President Trump is a fascist?
I've spoken about...
That's okay. You can just say yes.
Okay. All right.
Okay. It's easier. It's easier than explaining it. I don't mind.
But the warmth between them seems unlikely to last. Mamdani never pretended to be anything other than what he is. His platform was printed, bound, and posted online months in advance. An 11.5% corporate tax, the highest in the continental United States. Vacancy taxes on landlords who keep apartments empty, commercial rent control, strict good cause evictions statewide. He sold it as simple arithmetic. Take from the top 1% and deliver to the bottom 80%. However, the top 1% started moving the decimal points. Whispers of a corporate exodus have filled Midtown. Florida real estate listings have spiked, with firms such as Citadel eyeing Miami expansions. Real estate titans insist the sky isn't falling, at least not yet. Still, the fear is that permanent rent freezes and the elimination of vacancy decontrol could force firms to rethink every property they own in the city. The carnage for small businesses is only beginning to be modeled. Many small businesses are facing the choice of reducing their employees' hours, laying them off, or relocating. And in the restaurant industry, a staple of the city, early models suggest that 15 to 20% of eateries would be at risk of closure. Mamdani waves away the exodus talk the same way former Mayor Bill de Blasio once did. But this time, the rich really can leave. Red state governors waving zero-income tax flags have become increasingly enticing. New York has survived bankruptcy scares, 9/11, Hurricane Sandy, and COVID. It will survive Zohran Mamdani. But survival is not the same as flourishing. I'm Amy DeLaura for Washington Examiner.
Thank you, Amy. You can read the full story and all the articles we've discussed in today's episode in the Washington Examiner magazine. This has been your Inside Scoop. I'm Jim Antle, your host. We'll catch you next time.